She fired him in front of the entire executive floor, called him a liability with no business being near people like her, and ordered security to walk him out before lunch. 11 hours later, that same man was the only thing standing between her and two black trucks sent to make sure she never walked into a boardroom again. On a Thursday in late October, at exactly 7:41 in the morning, a woman named Vivian Crane decided that the new driver was beneath her notice. By the end of the next day, every choice she had made about him would come back to decide whether she lived or died on a flooded service road outside the city. What no one in that glass tower knew was that the quiet man in the worn jacket had once spent 11 years doing the one thing none of them could imagine, and he had walked away from all of it, for reasons he never explained to anyone. So what did she set in motion that morning? And why did it almost cost her everything she owned? The road to that exact ambush had begun 48 hours earlier, with a borrowed coat and an empty gas tank. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is the only part of this that makes any sense. Daniel Mercer stood outside the glass tower of Halloran Maritime in downtown Cleveland, smoothing down the front of a sport coat that wasn't even his. He had borrowed it the night before from the man who lived 2 doors down, because the only decent jacket Daniel owned had a tear along the seam that no amount of careful folding could hide. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He already knew what it was without looking, a reminder from the after-school program that this month's balance was still sitting unpaid, the third notice in as many weeks. He silenced it and breathed out slow, the way he used to before something that mattered. 4 years had passed since he buried his wife, Rachel. 4 years of driving for a rideshare app, picking up overnight security shifts at warehouses by the lake, doing whatever the week demanded to keep a small apartment warm and a small life steady. This was supposed to be temporary, too, just one more interview that probably went nowhere. But the pay listed for this position was nearly triple what he was clearing in a month. And there was a pair of winter boots in a store window that a certain someone at home had stopped asking for, which was somehow worse than if she had kept asking. So Daniel walked through the front doors and gave his name to the woman at the front desk. The waiting room was full of men in suits that actually fit, tailored, pressed, expensive in the quiet way that only real money is quiet. They were the kind of men who clearly saw driving an executive around as the first rung on a ladder they fully intended to climb. They looked at Daniel once in his borrowed coat and his clean but worn boots, decided he was no threat to anything they wanted, and went back to their phones. Daniel didn't mind being underestimated. He had built most of an adult life on it. A man in a gray suit eventually called his name and walked him down a corridor and into a service elevator that dropped them into an underground vehicle bay. Waiting, there was a tall man with silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a career learning to read people before they spoke. He introduced himself simply as Garrett Hale, head of security for the firm's principal executives. He gestured toward a black sedan parked under the white fluorescent lights. "Standard run," Garrett said. "Open the rear door, seat the passenger, confirm the route, and we're finished. 5 minutes, maybe less." Daniel didn't move toward the door. Instead, he walked the length of the car first. Garrett's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "Is there a problem?" "Not yet," Daniel said. "I'm checking whether there's going to be one." He crouched at the rear wheel, ran 2 fingers along the seam where the bumper met the body panel, then opened the trunk and lifted the cover over the spare. It took him a little under 2 minutes. When he stood back up, he had his answer. "This run-flat insert expired about 10 months ago," he said. "If that tire lets go on the interstate at speed, whoever is sitting in the back has no backup. I'm not driving anyone anywhere until that's replaced." Garrett studied him for a long moment. Behind him, a younger staffer shifted his weight, plainly uncomfortable that 2 years of routine inspections had somehow missed something this simple. "We've had 5 interviews in here today," Garrett said slowly. "You're the first one who opened the trunk." Daniel shrugged. "The parts nobody bothers to check are usually the parts that get somebody hurt." That was the exact moment the elevator doors slid open behind them, and a woman in a charcoal suit walked into the bay with a phone pressed to her ear and the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in her life waited in a line. Vivian Crane was the firm's chief operating officer, the executive everyone in the building either wanted to become or wanted to avoid, and she did not look like a woman who appreciated a delay. She ended her call, took in the small gathering around the sedan, and her eyes landed on Daniel the way you might glance at a stain on a carpet. "Why is there a delay?" she asked. "I have a meeting in 12 minutes, and I do not intend to be late to it because the help is standing around." Garrett opened his mouth, but Daniel answered first. "Because the spare tire in this car isn't safe, and I'm not driving anyone until it's fixed. If you want to be on time today, replacing it is the fastest way to get there." Vivian blinked. Then something in her expression cooled and hardened all at once. Nobody on the staff spoke to her like that, flat and even, with no apology folded into the sentence. "I don't recall asking the new driver for a safety lecture," she said. "I recall asking why I'm being made to wait. Open the door, we're leaving in this car." "No, ma'am," Daniel said. Not loud, not rude, just settled, like a man who had said harder words in harder places. "Not in this one." For a moment, the whole bay went still. And here is the thing about that moment that I want you to hold on to, because it matters more than it looks. Daniel had no idea that the woman glaring at him would in just over a day owe her life to the exact stubbornness she was about to punish him for. Vivian Crane was not a woman who lost the first exchange and let it go. She took down his name. She told Garrett, in the cool clipped tone of someone certain she would never be wrong, that drivers who refused direct instructions on day one were liabilities the firm did not need. And then she walked back to the elevator, made her meeting in the second car, and forgot about Daniel Mercer entirely. She would remember him soon enough. By the end of that day, against Vivian's stated wishes, Daniel had the job anyway, because Garrett Hale had been doing this long enough to know that the man who checks the trunk is the man you actually want behind the wheel. The principal Daniel would be driving wasn't Vivian at all. It was the firm's chairman, an older man named Walter Halloran, who had built the company over 40 years and had recently grown very tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. Daniel still remembers calling the after-school program from the parking garage that same afternoon, telling them the balance would be cleared by Friday. He remembers a small voice on the phone later that evening, asking carefully, the way she always asked, whether this meant he could stop doing the late shifts that kept him out past bedtime. He told her he hoped so. He meant it more than he could say. What he didn't know yet was that this job was never going to be about tire pressure and travel routes. It was about to pull him back toward a world he had folded up and put away the day he turned in his uniform 4 years earlier. The first 2 weeks were almost quiet. Daniel learned the rhythms of Walter Halloran's world the way he had once learned the layout of a building before he ever had to move through it in the dark, without ever announcing that he was paying attention. He noticed which executives lingered near the car at pickup, hoping for 30 seconds of FaceTime with the chairman. He noticed how often Vivian Crane scheduled her own meetings during the exact windows when Walter was supposed to be unreachable, always with the tight, overpolished courtesy of someone working very hard to look calm. He noticed Garrett's deputy, a younger man named Trevor Baskin, adjusting the garage cameras more often than the maintenance logs could explain, his hands a little too quick, like a man double-checking his own work because he was afraid of what it would mean if he didn't. Daniel said nothing, not yet. A man who once held clearances he could never talk about learns early that staying quiet is what keeps the door open. Walter noticed things about Daniel too. The man never asked for a bonus. He never traded gossip with the other staff. He never tried to make himself memorable through charm. He simply did the work better than anyone before him, and then he went home. One afternoon, waiting in the lower garage, Walter overheard part of a phone call he was never meant to hear. Daniel's voice was low and careful. "I know it's late," he was saying. "It'll be cleared by Friday, I promise. She's a good kid. She just needs the boots before the cold really sets in. Daniel caught the old man's eyes in the mirror afterward and said nothing. Walter said nothing either. But he filed it away, the same patient way Daniel filed away everything he saw. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks in, when Daniel first noticed the gray sedan parked across from the tower after a long dinner meeting. Nothing strange on its own, except he had seen that same car that morning on the far side of the city, outside a private breakfast. Same cracked side mirror. Same driver, sitting just a little too still behind the wheel. Once is nothing, he told himself. Twice is worth remembering. 3 days later, the same sedan turned up outside a downtown club in an entirely different part of Cleveland, and 3 stopped being a coincidence. He logged all of it that night, times, locations, the partial plate. He brought it to Garrett the next morning. Garrett read through the notes with the polite patience of a man who didn't quite believe him yet. Men like Mr. Halloran attract this kind of attention all the time, he said. Competitors, reporters, the occasional crank. The plate traces back to a rental fleet. No flags. Daniel thanked him and let it go. But that night he made a decision on his own. The next morning, without telling a soul, Daniel rerouted Walter's 9 o'clock, taking a longer path nobody on staff could have predicted. The gray sedan was waiting at the alternate exit anyway. There was only one way that was possible. Someone with access to the route information had passed it along. He told Walter directly that afternoon. Stopped at a red light with the sedan 3 cars back in the mirror, and he said it the way a man delivers a status report. Not a warning meant to frighten anyone. That car has followed us 3 times this week, on 3 different routes, including one I changed and told no one about. I don't think it's a coincidence anymore. Walter was quiet for a long moment, studying him in the mirror. What do you need to know for certain? I need to check this car myself tonight, with no one on staff told in advance. If there's a way they're tracking us, I'll find it. Walter didn't ask why his driver suddenly sounded less like a driver and more like a man trained for exactly this. He simply nodded. Do it. That night, in the lowest level of the garage, Daniel worked beneath the sedan with a small magnetic detector he had bought that afternoon. 22 minutes in, his hand brushed something that didn't belong. A small sealed unit mounted just above the rear axle, transmitting quietly on a frequency that had nothing to do with the car's own systems. He held it up under the garage lights and felt something cold settle in his chest. The old familiar feeling of confirming a threat he had hoped was nothing. When he brought it to Garrett, the older man's face changed for the first time since they had met. This wasn't dropped here by accident, Garrett said quietly, turning it over in his gloved hands. Whoever placed this had bay access. That means it's someone on staff. Neither of them said a name out loud, but they both already had a short list, and Trevor Baskin was on it. It was Garrett, in fact, who finally learned the truth about who Daniel really was. Standard procedure, he told himself. Running a deeper background check on anyone this capable working this close to the chairman. What came back stopped him cold. 11 years in naval special warfare. Multiple deployments he could read almost nothing about. An honorable discharge Daniel had requested himself after turning down a path that would have meant another year away from a household that had just lost its center. Garrett brought the file to Walter without a word, set it on the desk, and left the room. Walter found Daniel that evening, waiting by the car, and asked him about it the way he asked about everything, plainly, without softening it into something easier. You were a Navy SEAL. It wasn't really a question. Daniel met his eyes and didn't look away. I was. It wasn't relevant to driving a car, so I didn't bring it up. I listed it on the application because leaving it off would have been a lie. There's a difference. Could you protect me if it came to that? Having the ability and having the right to use it are 2 very different things, Daniel said. You have a security team for that. I'm your driver. Walter studied him a beat longer than necessary. Then why does it feel like you're the only person in this building who saw something was wrong before it became a problem? Daniel didn't have a clean answer for that, so he gave the old man the truth instead. My wife was a federal investigator, he said quietly. She worked trafficking and smuggling cases for years. There was one that never closed. She didn't come home from it. I was overseas when it happened. I came back to a funeral and a little girl who barely recognized my voice on the phone. I decided that day I wasn't going to be a man who only came home sometimes anymore. Walter said nothing right away. For a man who ran one of the largest firms in the state, he understood in that moment that some silences are more respectful than any words. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I'm not telling you so you'll feel sorry for me," Daniel answered. "I'm telling you because you asked a direct question, and you deserve a direct answer." Walter nodded slowly, and something in the air between them shifted, quiet and unspoken, the kind of trust that doesn't announce itself with a handshake. Neither of them knew yet that across the city a phone call was already being prepared, one that would arrive late that same night, calm and unhurried, in the voice of someone who believed they were making an offer rather than delivering a threat. The call came after the apartment had gone dark and quiet, after Daniel had stood for a moment in a doorway listening to the small, even breathing of someone fast asleep, before stepping back into the hall to answer his buzzing phone. A flat, disguised voice on the other end told him to keep Friday's route exactly as scheduled, no changes, no warnings to anyone, and the people he cared about would never have a single reason to know anything had happened at all. The line went dead before he could respond. Daniel stood frozen in that hallway for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked back to the bedroom door, pushed it open just enough to confirm what he already knew, that the one person in the world he could not afford to lose was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of how close something ugly had just come to her door. And only then did he let himself breathe again. He had survived ambushes before. He had pulled people out of places no one was supposed to walk away from. But nothing in 11 years had prepared him for the particular cold that comes when a threat is aimed at your child. He wrote down every word of the call before he could forget a single syllable. And then he made a decision the way he always did under pressure, fast, with the next 2 steps already mapped before he moved. The next morning he called Garrett before sunrise and asked for one thing: a restricted schedule protocol for the rest of the week, limiting advance notice of Walter's movements to 3 people only: himself, Garrett, and one administrative contact they both trusted completely. Garrett didn't ask why. When Daniel explained an hour later, laying out exactly what the masked voice had said, the older man sat very still, the way a man sits when he is doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. "Someone threatened your family to control what happens Friday," he said slowly. "Yes, and you're still planning to drive the route. I'm planning to be ready for whatever happens on it," Daniel said. "That's different." Garrett offered, almost at once, to move Daniel's daughter somewhere secure for the week. A full detail, around-the-clock eyes, anything he needed. It was a generous offer, and Daniel could tell the man meant every word. He turned it down anyway. "That's exactly the response they're hoping for," he explained. "Fear that makes you shrink your whole world down to something small enough to control. She doesn't need a fortress. She needs her week to stay as ordinary and boring as it was yesterday. That's how I keep her safe." Garrett looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable behind his eyes. "You're the only man I've ever met who turned down my help because it was the wrong kind of help." Daniel didn't have an answer for that one either. So he said nothing and went to check the tires one more time before Friday came. Friday morning arrived gray and still, the kind of quiet that always feels louder than it should. The small convoy assembled at 7:30. An advance car ahead, the sedan in the middle with Daniel behind the wheel, and Walter in the back, and a trailing vehicle bringing up the rear under the command of Garrett's deputy, Trevor Basque in. Walter had insisted on keeping the appointment exactly as scheduled, a signing at a shipping office on the lakeshore east of the city, where he intended to formally block the sale of the firm's port terminal, a sale his chief operating officer had been pushing hard for weeks. The chairman had told Daniel the night before that the answer to being threatened was never to vanish. It was to become impossible to ignore. Daniel understood that kind of thinking better than the old man realized. He had built a career on it. 40 minutes outside the city, the advance vehicle suddenly veered off the planned route, its driver reporting an incident ahead over the radio. The transmission cut to static halfway through the sentence, and it was not the kind of static the weather makes. Daniel's eyes moved between the mirror and the road, cataloging what he saw the way he had been trained to a decade before. A dark truck had closed in behind them, riding far too tight for any ordinary driver. Ahead, a second truck was angling out from a maintenance pull-off, sliding sideways to choke both lanes at once. "Stop the car," Walter said, his voice steady, the voice of a man used to solving problems with calm authority. Daniel didn't stop the car. "Get down and stay down," he said, and there was nothing in his tone that left room for argument. He cut the wheel hard to the left and reversed into a narrow service road half hidden behind a drainage barrier. A path that existed on no commercial map but showed up clearly on the port access charts he had quietly pulled from a contact 3 days earlier, just in case. The trucks couldn't follow without grinding their undercarriages against the concrete channel markers. He had measured that clearance himself, days before anyone had given him a reason to. The sedan bounced hard over the rutted, rain-soaked surface, and Walter stayed, pressed below the headrest, exactly where he had been told to stay. Without a single question, which told Daniel everything about how far the old man's trust had come in 3 short weeks. He killed the car's tracking signal so it couldn't be followed through the fleet system, and reached beneath the seat for a small location beacon he had hidden there. Days earlier, registered to a contact entirely outside the company. 3 miles down the access road, he pulled into an abandoned way station near the water, parked out of sight, and finally let himself breathe. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning in the dim light. "I'm fine," Walter said, though his hands were shaking. "How did you know that road was there?" "I make it my business to know the way out of a place before I ever need it," Daniel said. It was there, in that single cold room, lit by an old emergency lantern, that Daniel noticed the chairman's phone running unusually warm in his pocket. The telltale sign of something running constantly in the background, even while the screen stayed dark. He ran a quick check and found surveillance software, authenticated through a certificate that belonged to the company's own internal security system. "Someone on your security team put spyware on your personal phone," he said, holding the screen up so the old man could see it himself. "This certificate is 3 weeks old." Walter stared at it for a long moment. That's about when Trevor Basque joined the protective detail full-time. They spent the next 90 minutes in that small room laying out everything each of them knew, the way 2 people piece together a puzzle when neither one holds all the corner pieces alone. Walter explained the corporate side. Vivian Crane had been driving a sale of the company's lakefront shipping terminal to a buyer whose ownership traced back through 4 shell companies to an address no one could explain. The price offered was far below what the terminal was actually worth, low enough that it only made sense if the real thing being bought wasn't the terminal at all. "It's the cargo," Daniel said slowly, putting it together out loud. "Whoever buys that terminal gets to move whatever they want through it, and nobody asks questions. And if I'm gone for the next 48 hours, Walter added quietly, the company charter lets the board hand emergency authority to the next ranking executive. Vivian has been collecting quiet commitments from board members for 6 weeks. Daniel sat back and looked at him steadily. "Then this was never about getting you out of the way for an afternoon. They need you gone long enough to push the sale through, and discredited enough afterward that nobody questions how it happened." He paused, and they needed a driver to blame it on. "That's why they hired me through her objection and let me stay. I wasn't a risk to their plan. I was the story they were going to tell once it was done." Before either of them could sit with that, the backup radio crackled, Garrett's voice compressed and low. "Don't call local police," he said. "Crane controls that channel through a contact in the department. I've been locked out of the main system." Three of our people got sent 20 minutes off chasing a fake emergency call. There's already a report filed saying the chairman's car went off the road and his status is unknown. Daniel verified Garrett through a challenge phrase set before departure, in case the line itself had been turned. Once he had it, he made his decision fast, the way he always did. "We're not going back to the estate," he told Walter. "We need somewhere with its own jurisdiction, somewhere Crane can't reach." He knew exactly where that was. Years earlier, during a joint rescue exercise on the lake, Daniel had worked alongside a Coast Guard officer named Russell Pratt, who had handed him a direct line and told him certain situations call for a person rather than a department. Daniel hadn't used that number once in 4 years. He used it now. They reached Pratt's station using a borrowed maintenance truck from the way station and a shoreline access road that didn't appear on any standard map, the kind of path only someone who studied coastlines for a living would think to use. At the station, Walter recorded a video statement on Pratt's secured tablet. He was alive. He was in voluntary contact with law enforcement. The convoy had been compromised from the inside, and any decision the board made in his absence, without verified confirmation, would be challenged the moment he returned. The footage went through an encrypted channel to the firm's independent counsel, an attorney named Diane Whitfield, along with everything the two men had pieced together overnight. By morning, the story had already leaked to 3 financial news outlets, exactly as Daniel knew it would. The version in circulation claimed the chairman's newly hired driver, a man with an undisclosed military past, had isolated him from his security detail. A compensation document had supposedly been recovered from an abandoned truck, made out to that driver, unsigned, for ensuring the chairman's unavailability. Vivian Crane, through a spokesperson, expressed her deep concern for Walter's safety and her hope for a swift resolution. Daniel read the headline on Pratt's tablet and felt something settle into place that wasn't quite anger. Something colder and more useful than that. "They're not just trying to remove you anymore," he told Walter. "They're trying to make sure that even if you survive this, nobody trusts you enough afterward to let you keep running your own company. And they're trying to put me in a cell for the rest of it." Walter's jaw tightened. "Then we go in through the front door, not the service entrance. If I show up looking like I'm hiding, that confirms everything they're saying." Daniel didn't argue. He arranged for 2 off-duty deputies in plain clothes to secure the lobby, and he chose a route into the building that avoided every blind spot a camera or a shooter might use. The board meeting had been moved up 12 hours overnight, the notice issued at 3 in the morning while Walter was still sitting in a way station by lantern light. The message was clear. Someone wanted this decided before he could walk back into the room. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, Walter walked in without hesitation, without performance, carrying a single folder under his arm. Vivian Crane stood near the head of the table, mid-sentence, explaining to the board that the chairman's disappearance and his unstable judgment under pressure made it their responsibility to stabilize leadership during the crisis. She stopped talking the instant she saw him walk through the door, and just behind him, in a clean but unremarkable jacket, came the driver she had tried to fire. On his first morning, the man she had called a liability with no business near people like her. Walter sat down, set the folder on the table, and looked around the room. "I understand there's been some concern about my judgment," he said. "Let's address that directly." He laid it out, piece by piece. The tracking device found beneath the car and the short list of staff with the access to plant it. The spyware certificate pulled from his own phone. Trevor Baskin's falsified incident report. Set directly against Garrett Hale's original route recommendation, the one that had been quietly overridden the morning of the ambush. The unsigned compensation document recovered from the abandoned truck. And then Diane Whitfield's corporate trace, connecting the terminal's mystery buyer through 4 shell companies straight back to an account controlled by Vivian Crane's own chief of staff. A board member who had served for 2 decades cleared his throat and asked, carefully, whether the board should really place this much confidence in a driver whose background had been kept off his own hiring file. Walter looked at the man steadily. His application listed his military service accurately. The only people in this room with something genuinely hidden are sitting at this table. Garrett confirmed every piece of the security documentation himself. Diane walked the board through the ownership trail line by line. A finance auditor named Howard Lemke appeared by video from 2 floors down and confirmed that internal warnings about the terminal sale had been raised weeks earlier and quietly buried. And here is the part I want you to watch closely, because it's the part that tells you exactly who Vivian Crane was. She did not crack. She did not apologize. She squared her shoulders and told the room that everything she had done, all of it, had been to protect the company from a chairman who had grown too sentimental to make hard decisions. She said she had followed protocol. She said history would prove her right. She said the word standards 3 times in 2 minutes, as if repeating it could turn a betrayal back into a strategy. Even then, with the evidence stacked on the table in front of her, she would not bend a single inch. Walter's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. A plan that requires my disappearance for 48 hours. And a story afterward calling me unstable is not a business decision, he said. It's an act against my freedom, dressed up in a suit and called strategy. The room stayed silent for a long moment after that. Then the board called a vote. Vivian Crane was suspended pending a full independent investigation. The terminal sale was halted immediately. Trevor Baskin was arrested within the hour on conspiracy and evidence tampering charges. And within days, the trail connecting the ambush trucks led investigators to a smuggling network that had been moving cargo quietly through the region's ports for years. The same kind of network, it turned out, that a federal investigator named Rachel Mercer had been chasing the night she didn't come home. Daniel wasn't in the boardroom for any of it. He was 2 floors down, giving a calm, factual statement to a Coast Guard investigator, describing only what could be confirmed through a timestamp, a recording, or a physical piece of evidence. When the investigator asked about his military background, he said his service record was available through the proper channels if anyone needed it, and that nothing in the last 24 hours had required anything beyond careful driving and careful handling of evidence. Walter found him in the hallway afterward. I told the board you acted with my full knowledge and consent at every decision point, he said. They needed to hear that directly from me. Thank you for saying it, Daniel answered. Have you eaten anything today? The old man asked. Daniel realized, almost surprised, that he hadn't thought of it once. That evening, in his office with the late light pouring across the floor, Walter offered Daniel a permanent position overseeing his personal security. A significant salary, full benefits, enough to clear every debt the man had carried since Rachel died. Daniel turned it down, gently but firmly. I didn't leave the service because I ran out of ability, he explained. I left because I ran out of willingness to live my whole life on permanent standby, missing the ordinary moments that don't feel important until you've already missed too many of them. I was overseas for the first day of school I can never get back. I'm not doing that again, even for better pay. Walter listened without trying to talk him out of it, which was exactly how Daniel knew the old man had actually heard him. They settled instead on something smaller, a limited advisory role, a handful of hours each month reviewing transportation and security procedures, nothing that would ever again require him to be on call around the clock. 6 months later, Vivian Crane was formally removed by a shareholder vote that left no room for ambiguity. The independent investigation revealed a tangle of personal debt she had buried for years, the kind she would never let a single colleague see, the kind that made one corrupt deal feel to her like the only door still open. It didn't excuse what she did. It just meant she wasn't simply a villain in a boardroom. She was a person who had run out of quiet ways to fix her own mistakes and chose the loudest, most damaging one instead. Trevor Baskin was convicted on conspiracy and tampering charges. The smuggling network connected to the ambush was still being dismantled. piece by piece, and for the first time since Rachel had been taken from him, Daniel watched a case connected to that same dark world actually move forward instead of going cold. The after-school balance was paid off in full. The winter boots had been bought weeks before, and worn so often they were already scuffed at the toe, which is its own quiet kind of happiness. It was around then that Daniel first really noticed Diane Whitfield, the independent counsel who had walked the board through the ownership trail without ever once raising her voice. She had spent 6 months making sure every charge held, every document was clean, every protection was airtight, and somewhere in all those careful late hours she had started staying a few minutes longer at the end of their meetings, and so had he. She was the kind of person who measured her words the way he measured exits, and neither of them was in any hurry. On a quiet Saturday with nothing scheduled, Walter called Daniel directly instead of going through the office. No detail, no notice filed anywhere, and asked if he could drive him somewhere with no destination attached to it at all. Daniel showed up in his own car this time. An old sedan he had spent 4 weekends repairing himself, nothing like the company's fleet. Walter looked at it for a moment and asked whether a man in his position could really be seen riding around in something like that and still be considered safe. Safety was never about what the car cost, Daniel told him. The old man opened the front passenger door, not the rear, and got in without being asked twice. They drove east along the lake, longer than necessary, slower than efficient, through the kind of late afternoon light that turns ordinary water into something worth stopping for. "I used to think the sealed file was the most extraordinary thing about you," Walter said eventually, watching the lake slide past the window. "The training. The man who could put a car down a flooded service road in the middle of an ambush without blinking. And now I think the extraordinary part was that you had all of that and never once used it to make anyone around you feel smaller, including yourself." Daniel was quiet for a moment, letting that settle. "Getting someone out alive, that part I trained for," he finally said. "Nobody trains you for the part after, when there's nothing left to run from, and you just have to decide to stay anyway." That same evening, Vivian Crane sat in a small rented apartment on the wrong side of the city she had once expected to own a piece of, scrolling without really reading, and she came across a photograph from a charity dinner the firm had hosted the week before. There was Walter Halloran, restored and steady. There was Garrett Hale beside him. And there, near the edge of the frame, was the driver she had tried to throw out of the building on his first morning, standing easy and unhurried, with Diane Whitfield's hand resting lightly in the crook of his arm. The two of them caught mid-law at something the camera hadn't heard. The man she had decided was beneath her notice was being looked at by a woman widely considered one of the sharpest minds in the state. The way no one had looked at Vivian in a very long time. She set the phone face down on the table and sat for a while in the quiet of everything she had thrown away, and there was no one left to blame for any of it but the woman in the reflection of the dark screen. Daniel never learned she saw it, and wouldn't have cared much if he had. He was busy with smaller, better things. There was a stopwatch involved now, a birthday gift he'd be hearing about for years, and a small, merciless voice that liked to count the seconds of his morning runs from the front step, calling out the numbers like a tiny coach who took the job very seriously. There was a lunchbox shaped like something with too many teeth, left on the passenger seat one too many mornings, that he kept forgetting to carry back inside. There was a crayon drawing taped to the dash of the old sedan, curling a little at one corner, that he had quietly decided was never coming down. He had spent 4 years trying to rebuild an ordinary life one shift at a time, and somewhere along that lakeshore drive he understood that he had finally done it. Not by being the most dangerous man in the room, by being the one who checked the trunk, who came home before dark, who refused to let anyone, powerful or otherwise, decide that a quiet life was a small one. "Is that what you're doing now?" Walter had asked, back on that road by the water. "Staying?" Daniel looked out at the light turning gold over the lake. at a direction that wasn't leading toward another deployment and wasn't running from one either. "I think I finally ran out of places," he said, "that need me more than this one does." This story is a work of fiction. The names, characters, businesses, places, and events are products of the imagination and used in a dramatized way. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real companies or events, is entirely coincidental. The details about vehicle run-flat inserts, magnetic tracking devices, mobile phone certificate spyware, port terminal shell company structures, and Coast Guard jurisdiction are presented in a simplified, dramatized form for storytelling and should not be taken as technical or legal instruction. A personal note from me, the writer. What stayed with me while putting this together wasn't the ambush or the boardroom. It was the smallest decision in the whole thing, a man crouching down to check a tire that nobody else had bothered to look at. I keep coming back to that because it's the quietest form of respect I can think of, caring about a part of someone's safety they'll never even know was at risk. We tend to measure people by the loud things, the titles, the suits that fit, the cars they're driven around in. This story is my small argument for measuring them by the trunk instead, by whether they do the unglamorous, unwatched work of looking out for other people when there's nothing in it for them. Vivian had every advantage and used it to make people smaller. Daniel had every reason to be bitter and used what he had to keep people safe, then chose, in the end, an ordinary life over an important-looking one. If there's one thing I hope you carry out of this, it's that dignity isn't something you're handed with a job title. It's something you practice, usually when no one is watching. Thanks for staying to the end. It means more than you know.